All right, so now we're going to continue talking about the late Middle Ages. And during this time, we also have a major crisis in the church, and that's what we're going to look at on some of these crises and their impact on Christianity in Western Europe. The High Middle Ages represented the high point of the church power in Europe. The popes like Gregory and Innocent were able to expand their power over the kings and over the people's beliefs and behaviors. But when we get into the late Middle Ages, we start to see a decline in power of the popes. And this decline comes about in fights over the issue of clerical exemption. Now, one of the privileges that the church claimed during the Middle Ages was that church officials were exempt from taxation and exempt from being subject to royal law. So they were saying that basically, if the church doesn't have to pay any taxes and a church official who commits a crime would not end up being tried by the king's court because they are an extension of that. And if the church doesn't pay taxes, then they don't have to follow all of the laws, and neither should the priests. And so rather, they're going to be tried by a church court instead. Now, these issues come to a head in a big fight that breaks out in the late Middle Ages between King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII. So Philip is fighting the 100 Years' War against England. He needs to raise money, so he wants to start taxing churches as well as taxing the people of France to pay for his war. But Pope Boniface really objects to this taxation. Eventually, Pope Boniface will agree that churches may make a donation to the cause if they so choose, but he prevents Philip from claiming that he's able to tax the church. The other big issue that they fight over is the issue of making church officials subject to royal law. One of the bishops of France insults King Philip and basically says that he should be put on trial for treason. The king does. The king wants this bishop put on trial. But again, Pope Boniface resists this because he doesn't want the church officials coming under the power and control of the king. So in 1302, the Pope issues a papal bull or a papal decree, a declaration that's called an unum sanctum. And in this, he claims that he not only has supreme power in terms of spiritual power all over the Christians of Western Europe, but also he has supremacy when it comes to secular authority. So in other words, he also has power over the kings of Europe as well. The problem is that Boniface can say this, but he really doesn't have the ability to back up his words. As one French government official has claimed to have said, "My master sword is made of steel, the Pope's is made of words. My king has knights that can back up what he wants. The Pope does not." And in 1303, we find that the French troops arrest the Pope at his residence, and they put him basically under their control. And they eventually are, pressured to let him go, but the Pope's health becomes very compromised by his brief imprisonment, and he actually dies shortly thereafter. The subsequent pope that is elected is a French pope, and so that pope will give in to Philip a little bit more than Pope Boniface had. So we're beginning to see in this conflict of the power of the popes and the kings, and how that the power of the pope is starting to decline while the power of the kings are starting to rise. Another problem that breaks out shortly thereafter is that the pope starts getting into fights with nobles in Rome. And he gets scared for his life, and so he decides to leave Rome, and instead he moves to southern France, to a city called Avignon. Now, King Philip invites the Pope to come and stay in southern France, and many people of the time started to call this move from Rome to Avignon in France the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Now, think back to the last time you thought and heard the term Babylonian captivity. Remember, it's probably going to take you all the way back to ancient history, how the Hebrews were taken captive by the Babylonians. And so the Babylonian captivity is seen as punishment for sin of the Hebrew people in the Bible. And it's seen as a very negative thing. So to call this move to Avignon in France the Babylonian captivity, you can see that people of the time were interpreting this very negatively. And the reason why they saw this move as being so negative is because it appears to place the Pope under the control of the king. Because the king invites the Pope to come to southern France. He is actually giving money to the Pope. He's supporting his household. And so in return, everyone believes that the Pope is basically going to do whatever the French king tells him to do. And so this Avignon papacy, which is what we kind of call it, it's just the first Pope who is the first of many subsequent popes who are going to live in Avignon. And this is going to weaken the public support for the papacy. In 1378, the Pope decides to move back to Rome, so it appears like everything's going back to normal and life is going to be grand again. Unfortunately, the Pope who moves died shortly after returning to Rome, so they have to choose a successor. The cardinals meet, there's a lot of disagreement, but they finally choose an Italian. They don't want any more French popes because of the seeming connections to the King of France. So they choose an Italian named Urban to become the next pope. And they think that Urban's going to be very easily controlled, but they're wrong. As soon as Urban becomes pope, he really starts to control all of the bishops and makes them a little bit upset. So a group of bishops get together and they decide that they have made a big mistake in electing Urban to be pope. So what are they going to do? They choose a new pope by the name of Clement and essentially tell Urban that he's been fired, he has to leave the papacy and allow Clement to become the new pope. But when they tell Urban that he's fired, Urban basically responds that he has been elected pope by the grace of God and only God can remove him. And remember, we talked earlier about the powers of the pope, and the popes claim that they only answer to God, they don't answer to anyone else beneath them in the church or to any king. So this causes a split where Urban refuses to step down. Clement, who's been elected, also refuses to step down, and so he moves back to Avignon. And so what we have beginning in 1378 is we have two different people, each claiming to be pope, one living in Rome and the other in Avignon. And we call this the Great Schism of 1378, or the Western Schism. And it's easier to remember so that you don't get confused with the Great Schism between, Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Church and Catholicism. So the Western Schism. And so if we look at this map that we have on the slide, you can see all the areas in orange, places like France, part of modern-day Spain. They're going to throw their lot in with Pope Clement, the Pope living in Avignon. And France, whereas places like England, the Holy Roman Empire, they're going to throw their lot in with Urban, who's living in Rome. Now, you might be going, what's the big deal? Well, one thing is, who do you listen to? If the popes are putting out different decrees, which one do you listen to? In part, it depends on where you live. If you live in one area that is in orange on the map, you're going to listen to Clement. If you listen to the people if you live in the area of yellow, you're going to listen to Urban. But there's a sense that God does not want to have two popes. So one must be the false pope. So if you listen to the false pope, you might be in danger of going to hell. And this really does start to cause anxiety within Europe. Which pope do you listen to? Not only that, but if you look at the map, notice England and France support different popes. And England and France are engaged in a major war, the 100 Years' War. So another kind of consequence of this Western Schism is that by having two popes, there's no one who could intervene to maybe bring the sides together to create peace in this conflict. Kind of allows the conflict, if you will, to continue because, they're supporting two different popes. And it's really going to shake up Christianity in Western Europe. To try and heal the schism, the bishops decide to call for a church council. Now, this is a very action that in its own way weakens the powers of the Pope because in the dictates of the Pope, that document that we talked about from the High Middle Ages, where Pope Gregory outlined the powers the Pope should have, it quite clearly says in that document that only the Pope can call a church council. But now you have two people claiming to be Pope. They're fighting with each other. Who's going to call the church council? And so the bishops decide to call it on their own. They meet at a city of Pisa in 1409, and the decision comes out that they're going to elect a new man to be pope. And his name is Alexander V. You don't have to know his name, but they elect Alexander V and basically send notes to the other two popes saying, hey, you're both fired, step down. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. The other two popes by this time, the original two, Urban and Clement, have died. And you can see on the image, again, you don't need to know the names of all these popes, but what you need to know is there's still a pope in Avignon, and those are the ones in blue, and the pope in Rome are the ones in green. And notice how the split is continuing, but the initial two that each side, they continue to elect successors to that original pope. And now we have Alexander V, who's down here in yellow. He's elected by the Council of Pisa. And what we see happening is after the Council of Pisa, there are not two popes in Europe. There's three popes, each claiming to be the pope. Neither side listens to the council. They say, nope, I'm still pope, I'm pope. And now you have three people claiming to be pope. So what do you do? Well, the bishops go back to the drawing board and decide in 1415 to meet at the Council of Constance. The Council of Constance, their decision is to elect Martin V to become Pope. And actually, so they just do the same thing, and this time it actually works. Now, as Pope, you think, hey, that's not going to work, but it does work. And the Council of Constance, the bishops decide to convince the kings to support Martin as the one true Pope. And without the support of the kings, this plan would certainly not have worked. And so what we see happening here is they're going to be able to heal the schism. And we're going to go back to having one pope, and he's going to take up residence in Rome. But the pope whose power has been weakened because he's only able to support or only able to hold the position because of the support of the kings. And the papacy needs the power of the kings to help bolster his own power. And so we see here that the Western Schism is a major crisis in the church, and it does lead to a weakening of the pope's power. But not only that, it's also going to lead for calls of reform. And the Church of the Middle Ages, there's two major themes that emerge, right? The first is the Pope's political power does decline outside the Italian peninsula. So we've seen through the issues like clerical exemption and abnormal papacy, the Western Schism, all of this is contributing to the decline of their power. Secondly, all of those problems that we talked about, the Avignon papacy, these problems in the church leadership are going to lead us in a direction for major calls of religious reform, and ultimately the longer-term impact of leading us in the direction of the Reformation. And that's kind of the direction we're going to head into in the next lesson when we look at the very specific calls for reforming the church.